I get a letter from my city prosecutor here in Pasadena. It was a very dark, nasty letter. And he said, if you continue to meet, we will arrest you. We'll fine your church members $1,000 per person per meeting that you've been meeting at. We're talking about millions of dollars. And we have the right to arrest your church members. And I'm thinking to myself, because my father was a prisoner of war in North Korea as a pastor, and he escaped because the U.S. forces pushed the Communist Party into China, and he was able to come down with the American forces and eventually met my mom and had me, and we immigrated here. And I'm thinking about the stories he told, and I'm thinking, we're not in North Korea, we're not in Communist China, this is the United States, and they want to arrest church members, law-abiding citizens who pay their taxes, and they just want to worship. And then here's the crazy irony of the whole thing. Newsom is allowing prisoners out because of COVID crowdedness. He wanted social distancing in the prison, so all these prisoners are being released, and yet now we're being threatened to be arrested. And so we appealed to the district court for relief, and they said, no, you're breaking the law, you can be arrested.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. A major court battle was recently won by a church in California, and we're sitting here with the pastor, Pastor Che Ahn, to talk about this. Now, he's the pastor with Harvest Rock Church, and they recently won this battle that lets them stay open despite these COVID restrictions. Now, Pastor Che, it's a real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Well, thank you. It's honored to be on the Times here.
Great. So, this court battle has been going on for a while now. Basically, I understand you were told you couldn't hold in-person church.
Well, yeah, going all the way back to March, of course, everything was locked down, including President Trump asking for a 30-day lockdown nationally. And we got it, and so, we want to mitigate. We didn't know what this coronavirus was all about, and so we did our part. We closed down our service on March the 15th, and we had services online. And so we did that, and it was really sacrificial because we missed Easter, which was in April, and our anniversary is April the 4th. So we missed our anniversary service, and then we have our annual conference, and it's a conference, international conference. People come from all over the world, and that's also in April, and we had to cancel all that, which we were, willing to do because of the COVID. But we began to notice by May, we were seeing some discrepancies with the numbers. Now, back in those days, Governor Newsom said that potentially out of 40 million, 22 million Californians would get the COVID, which scared everyone. And we were seeing the numbers coming in, and my brother, who's a surgeon, who's part of our church, was saying that we are hardly getting any COVID patients. Of course, there's been a spike since then, but back in those days in March when we locked down, there was no patients. It was like a flat line. And they kept on saying, as long as the line is flat, we'll be okay, we could open up again. But even though the line was flat, the church was not open. And the thing that was really disheartening is that they declared us not essential from the beginning. Abortion clinics were essential, marijuana dispensaries were essential, of course liquor stores essential, and of course grocery stores, but not the church. So we wrote a letter to Governor Newsom with 150 pastors signed off on it.
I remember reporting on that.
Yeah, and so we said, we've been essential for the last 2,000 years. Where would the world be without the gospel of Jesus Christ and the church, the ecclesia? And the church has done so much good to help humanity during times of crisis. And so all the more during this COVID, we need to be there to help people, not just spiritually, but also emotionally, mentally, psychologically. But they were just concerned about the physical well-being, and we were saying, yeah, we're concerned with that as well. So when he did open, he opened for like a month and a half with mitigation, with small numbers, I think was 100 or less. And so we mitigated, of course. We had all those with underlying conditions, high-risk people to stay home, watch online, elderly to stay home. And we didn't even have children's ministry, so like maybe only 1/3 of the people showed up. And the people who showed up were young, and we had social distancing. We had people wear their masks. We took their temperature before they came. We sanitized everything, including every time they used the bathroom, we sanitized. And so we began to meet, but then he came out like 2 weeks later, said no singing or chanting. And my understanding of the First Amendment is that the state will not establish a state religion nor interfere with the free exercise thereof. And all of a sudden I'm hearing him saying, here's, you can meet, but you can't sing. Well, 50% of what we do is worship, is praise. And so I just said, this is not right. And then George Floyd death took place end of May, and the riots started in Los Angeles, and Governor Newsom got on television, did a press conference, and we're talking about right here in Los Angeles, 100,000 marching, wall-to-wall people, no social distancing, they're shouting, and it turned very violent as they looted and caused tremendous damage. And Newsom does a press release and says, you know, we heard your voices need to be heard, you're exercising your First Amendment rights, and we will protect you. And during this time, he just had locked down the church again. And I'm thinking, he's defending the First Amendment rights, which I agree with. You know, our First Amendment rights of free speech has to be defended, as long as it's not violent. But our right to assemble and to worship also have to be defended. So at that time, I talked to my attorney, now it's around July, and we decided to sue Governor Newsom and to see if we can get the courts to agree with us to have in-person service, as long as we mitigate, because we're seeing other things open up but not the church. Well, long story short, I get a letter from my city prosecutor here in Pasadena. It was a very dark, nasty letter, and he said, if you continue to meet, we will arrest you. We'll fine your church members $1,000 per person per meeting that you've been meeting at. We're talking about millions of dollars. And we have the right to arrest your church members. And I'm thinking to myself, because my father was a prisoner of war in North Korea as a pastor, and he escaped because the U.S. forces pushed the Communist Party into China, and he was able to come down with the American forces and eventually met my mom and had me, and we immigrated here. And I'm thinking about the stories he told, and I'm thinking, we're not in North Korea, we're not in communist China, this is the United States, and they want to arrest church members, law-abiding citizens who pay their taxes, and they just want to worship. And then here's the crazy irony of the whole thing. Newsom is allowing prisoners out because of COVID crowdedness. He wanted social distancing in the prison, so all these prisoners are being released, and yet now we're being threatened to be arrested. And so we appealed to the district court for relief, and they said, no, you're breaking the law, you can be arrested. We went to the Ninth Circuit for that, and they said, no, we will not grant you an injunction. And finally, we went to the Supreme Court, and they weighed in, and it was right after the Thanksgiving decision in New York, where they said 5-4, it was unconstitutional to limit the size in the Catholic diocese and the Jewish synagogue. And they contacted us, and they said, yes, what they're doing is unconstitutional, and go back to the Ninth Circuit to correct that. And they gave a roadmap of what the court should do. Meanwhile, we still sued Governor Newsom, and we just felt like our First Amendment rights were violated. And what happened was, long story short again, it took us until February the 5th, we got the news that the Supreme Court decided in our favor, 6-3, which was a kind of a shock because even John Roberts agreed. And he agreed because he had been vacillating. You know, he's been siding with the liberal and siding with the conservative in different cases, but he agreed with our First Amendment rights of being able to meet as a church in person, but we're still contending for the size because they're now saying 25%, and they're still not sure about the singing, and they just said, give us more information on why you should sing and why your numbers should not be limited. So right now, as we're talking, we are negotiating with the courts, and I don't know if that's the right term to say, negotiating, but we are appealing the two other things that were up in the air. But the good news is that churches can now meet in California and exercise their First Amendment rights. And not only in California, I believe it's for the whole nation, because they have clearly shown this is a violation of our First Amendment rights. By the way, to show you how extreme California was with Newsom, 49 states had already opened up churches, 33 completely without any limitation. We would still be locked down if we didn't win the Supreme Court case. So that shows you how egregious he's been in locking everything down. And of course, there's so much hypocrisy behind his edict, because he's going to the French Laundry. He's sending his kids to a private school, whereas the schools are still locked down in California as we speak today.
And so you observed kind of this whole process of them doing lockdowns, them selectively letting people violate the standards they put into place and then making excuses for it,
Right.
while maintaining lockdowns against people who seem to go against their values. And you saw the hypocrisy in this, and based on that, believe that maybe they're shutting you down for illegitimate reasons.
Yeah.
Is this accurate?
Absolutely. And of course, I think everyone saw the news with Pelosi getting her hair down in California when salons were locked down. And, we just see a lot of hypocrisy in the government. And of course, Newsom gave the edict during Thanksgiving, no more than 2 households. You have to eat outside and wear your mask in between bites. I'm sure he didn't do that, but he told everyone else to do it. And I just feel like it's just total control. It's totalitarianism. I don't feel he treats us like kids. We're adults. We know we have a pandemic. We should be responsible, to be careful, to practice social distancing. I don't know anyone who doesn't wear a mask when they go into Costco or Walmart in California. And so, I think people have been very good about it, but yet they just want to control a little bit more. And personally, I think it's been kind of criminal, because 19,000 businesses, that's the latest number I heard, have declared bankruptcy in California. So this is so hurt the middle class, the mom and pop stores in California, and people are out of work as a result of that. And I felt like it was so unnecessary, because I would go to restaurants during the few months it was open. There was social distancing. Everyone's wearing a mask. They took your temperature as you walked in. And there was no outbreak. There was no news. There was no signs based on this. Like in our church, there's not been one outbreak of COVID in our church service since we've been meeting since Pentecost Sunday, May 31st. And so I believe that people are responsible. They can follow the science without compromising their biblical conviction. And for us, we have a mandate. Hebrews chapter 10:25 says, don't forsake the assembling of the saints. We're to worship together. That's part of our responsibility before the Lord. And I just want to say bluntly, that Newsom is not the head of the church. Jesus is the head of the church. And so we're going to obey and submit to our Lord Jesus Christ, instead of an edict that I feel is just not based on science, and it's hypocrisy, because I see him saying one thing, doing another.
And so while they're letting prisoners out of prison, they're threatening to arrest you for gathering to worship.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you were resisting this, essentially. You were peacefully protesting by just holding your services as normal. And then, of course, they came after you for that.
Yes.
And threatened you with $1,000 fines each day, from what I understand.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we weren't. We're as peaceful as we can be. We had our service. We actually wrote a letter to our mayor in Pasadena, all the city council, chief of police, and said we're going to meet. We just want to be upfront, because we believe we're exercising a First Amendment right. We're not doing this out of rebellion. We're not trying to say in your face. We want to be totally upfront and transparent about this. We're going to meet because we believe, as Christians, that our founding fathers have given us the freedom to worship. But also, biblically speaking, there's over 51 others in the Bible that you cannot do online. Pray for one another, greet one another, lay hands on one another to pray for those who are sick. And we just feel that we need to obey the scriptural directives, instead of just acquiescing to something that there was no research or thought. They never came to us and say, hey, why do you want to meet? They just said from the beginning, you're not essential. And I feel like that is, again, government control that our founding fathers never wanted to have. The wall of separation of church and state from Thomas Jefferson is not for us not to be involved in the state, but for the state not to interfere with the free exercise thereof of our faith.
Now, I'm curious what the process was of you making this decision to open back up, because it's not, and especially when they started threatening you with are threatening arrest, threatening massive, over
Right.
millions in fines possibly. What was the process of being willing to risk persecution for the sake of your faith?
Well, I think first of all, I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. He changed my life. I was a drug addict, a part of the whole hippie drug culture in the 70s, and had a radical conversion. I was a Zen Buddhist, rebelled against Christianity, went into Eastern religion, but within 3 days, I had such an encounter with the Lord, I could not stop weeping for 3 days because I just had the revelation, it's Jesus. Jesus is what we're looking for. He is the way, the truth, and life. And within 2 weeks, I was completely off of drugs. So when you are that changed and transformed, you're so grateful for what He's done. And so in Galatians 1, Paul says, if I'm trying to please men, I'm not a servant of Christ. And what that translates into for me is that we have a tremendous relationship with our city. We have this incredible building that we bought in 2004 called the Crown Jewel of Pasadena. And one of the mayor came to me when we purchased this. He said, would you be open to opening up your facility for concerts? Because the previous owner had mothballed it for 10 years, so it hadn't been used. And so we said, of course we want to do it, because it's just being, what Christ would do. Jesus said, I came not to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. And so this is our way of practically serving our city. So our city loves us. The mayor gave us just a citation on the 10th anniversary of our ownership and just said, thank you so much for allowing concerts to take place. We allow the police to use this for free once a year for their awards night. And so we've used this building. And so, the temptation is try to please the city hall and not lock down, because we've developed this incredible rapport. But my allegiance first is to Jesus Christ, and that takes priority. And I realize is that I'm doing a disservice to our people. There are people who are depressed during this time. They need encouragement, they need prayer, they need counseling, they need worship. And there's something about socially interacting that is missing in the lockdown. Obviously, we distance ourselves, we space ourselves, but there's something about gathering together that's so therapeutic, that's so healing, and I believe it also improves your immune system. And so I had to weigh the two. Do I want to please my city and just continue to acquiesce to what they're asking me, or do I want to please Jesus? And to me, it was really a no-brainer. And when I did get persecuted with a letter, and by the way, we got letters from our community saying you're being selfish. People don't understand. You're killing your church members. How could you open up? We see, and they called the police on us, and the police came. And by the way, the police, they know us, and they know how we've been good to the police department. We give finances to the police just to help them with the budget. We don't have to. It's not taxes. We just give because we want to be a blessing to our city. And the police officer came and said, listen, we don't want to be here, but we have to respond to the calls that we got. And you know what? They said, they're lying to us, because they're saying people are coming without their mask on, and we've been here for almost 2 hours, and every person that we've seen come to your service and leave has worn a mask. And so we're not going to arrest you. We're just here going through the motion because my supervisor asked me to come because of the calls we received. So that's the kind of tension we had to deal with, of neighbors not understanding. And of course, they're not believers, so I don't expect them to understand, because spiritual things are spiritually understood. They just see in the natural, why are you open? And, isn't this, it could be a super spreader by gathering together. And by the way, once again, we've not had one COVID outbreak from our church. People have gotten COVID, but they got it at work or some other way, but they can't trace it to our service, because we have been very careful to mitigate.
Now, I understand that part of the recent decision by the Supreme Court, you're still limited in terms of capacity, from what I understand, and you're still not allowed to sing. And so you're still challenging this. Now, a lot of people would have won that first court case and be like, great, good enough, leave it there. But you're continuing to peacefully protest and make your voices heard.
Right.
And you're continuing your court case.
Here's the reason why, Josh, because, can I call you Joshua or Josh?
Yeah, Josh is fine.
Yeah, the reason why is because we found out that Governor Newsom made a deal with television, a certain television show that's a singing contest show, and he's allowing them to sing. And so, here the elites gather together and make a special deal but yet we can't sing. Now, we don't have a choir, so it's not like, we have a choir where you could spit towards the person in front of you and all that. So we felt like, what, we're socially distancing, and the Bible says, let the high praises of God be in your mouth. This is part of our prayer and our worship to God. We're to worship Him in spirit and in truth, and so we made a decision that, again, this is our First Amendment right. They can't interfere with the free exercise thereof. Of course, there's a lot you could argue about what that looks like, but nevertheless, we believe in our interpretation is that we have the freedom to worship. So we did argue, and we're still going to the courts over this. So, but until then, just like we've been meeting since May 31st, we're going to continue to sing, and even if, let's say, worst case scenario, even if I'm arrested for singing, they said, okay, you can meet, but no singing, and I'm arrested, I'll be arrested, because I feel throughout history, if people did not resist towards totalitarianism, or like whether it's Nazi Germany with Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, if we didn't have people that said no to authoritative control that's not even reasonable, I feel that we're going to see worse things happen, and so I want to do my part to make a prophetic stand without being rebellious, and in my own way to say this to me is an issue of justice, it's an issue of First Amendment rights, and I'm going to exercise that without having a bad attitude or being mean or unkind, and so we're going all the way with this. That's who I am, and that's my conviction.
And you mentioned your father was taken prisoner by the North Korean regime, and was liberated by the American troops there. What actually happened with this? And I'm curious how this has kind of informed your views on.
Well, my father grew up in the city of Pyongyang, which is now North Korea, the capital of North Korea. His father was a school teacher. My dad became a pastor, and on my father's side, Christianity goes all the way back to 1907. With my great-grandmother gave her life to Jesus Christ. By the way, it was American missionaries that came, a Presbyterian missionary to Pyongyang, Korea, which is now North Korea, and the Pyongyang Presbyterian Church was established, and my family were members of that church. And so my dad became a pastor, and was during the Korean War, and so as soon as in 1950, where North Korea was divided as communist and the South was declared to be a democratic state, they arrested all the pastors immediately, and my dad got arrested. And the Korean War began. And immediately, thank God for President Truman, thank God for General MacArthur, they got involved in the war. And the war was supposed to be over in 6 months. And they pushed the North Korean forces all the way to the Chinese border. But here's what happened. The Chinese jumped in. And with their sheer numbers, the war lasted until 1953. But during the time when they were pushed back, all the prisoners were released, including my dad. And of course, the safe place to go was what is now South Korea. He came down to South Korea, got involved with a church, Presbyterian Church, Yongnam Presbyterian Church, which was founded in 1945. And my mom went to that church, and so with her parents. And so they met, and they got married and had my sister and me. And then when the Korean government, after the Korean War, had sent students to Washington, D.C. to help rebuild South Korea, my dad was selected to be the pastor of the Baptist group. He basically applied and got the job. And so that's why we were allowed to immigrate. And I thank God, I mean, to immigrate to the United States, and I became a citizen when I came at the age of 4, but by the time 12 years old, we gained our citizenship. And Josh, I've traveled all over the world to almost 100 nations, and it's not a hyperbole because our ministry is in 70 nations. We have a base in 70 countries, and I still come back. And even though California's gone progressively left, it's still the best nation in the world, and I want to fight for the freedom that our founding fathers established, because I'm seeing what my father has described of communism coming in, socialism, Marxism, whatever you want to call it, coming into the United States, and especially here in California. And so one of the earmarks of democracy is freedom of religion. And so I want to fight for that, and I feel like there's a spiritual battle for the soul of America going on right now. And I felt like when President Trump was president, more was done to advance what I would call, just biblical values. He was the most pro-life president, pro-religious freedom, not just here, but throughout the world. So I'm doing my part as a pastor, and with this lawsuit, it's just part of my, it's a protest, but it's all part of democracy. Thank God we live in a country that will allow us to go to the Supreme Court, and thank God for the separation of powers, because if it was just strictly Congress or the president, we'd still be locked down. But the Supreme Court weighed in, and they sided for us, and we're very grateful to the Supreme Court. And I want to put a shout out to Matt Stavers, our attorney, a Liberty Counsel, did a tremendous job, and still doing a tremendous job for us as we're still fighting for total freedom.
I'm curious, your father, of course, was a pastor, was imprisoned under the North Korean communist regime. You mentioned he's kind of relayed some of these principles to you in terms of what communism is and maybe why it persecutes Christianity or other religions. What did he tell you about why communism persecutes religion?
Yeah, well, the thing that was really more telling is how he was very reticent to talk about it, the horrors of what he saw, the atrocities he saw. It was almost like he was traumatized by the atrocities. I mean, I don't think people realize the genocide that's going on in communist China right now, and their concentration camps with the Uyghur Muslims, but not just the Uyghur, we're talking about pastors also. Christian pastors that resisted the government are sent to these concentration camps. And I'm hearing of massed systematic rape taking place. We're talking about organ harvesting. We're talking about human rights abuse that is really that maybe next to Hitler's the genocide of the Jews has not been repeated. I'm sure there's been tremendous genocides in Soviet Union and Ukraine, and of course in Rwanda and other places, but it's happening right now on our watch. And so my dad would say things like, "You have no idea what took place," and he would just say, "I can't talk about that." It's like people who come back from war, Vietnam War, whatever, or the Gulf War, and they saw some atrocities. It's just really hard for them to talk. That, to me, was what told me. But I also know that he hated communism. He would talk about, watching the news and the Soviet Union, and he was for Reagan, tear down the wall, Mr. Gorbachev. And so just his political position, he really prayed for North Korea. And he prayed the communism would come down. That revival would break out in North Korea, things like that, and so it's not so much him describing the suffering he went through. He just was really grateful for the U.S. soldiers, and that's why to this day I thank God for anyone who has served our nation, and as in the armed forces and first responders, because I wouldn't be here. My dad would have been in prison. He would have been executed. He would never have met my mom. And how God had allowed us to come to the United States is very, very, moving. And it's amazing because here I am, Asian, Korean American, and I feel like I'm more patriotic than some of my white friends because they hate America. Some of what they say, and I just say, "What are you talking about? You don't know how good we have it here," because I've traveled, like I said, because of our ministry. To around 92 nations, and this is the best nation in the world.
Just last question. Through your work, really standing up against these laws and arguing that it's unconstitutional, which the Supreme Court has now ruled in your favor, it was unconstitutional,
right? And
taking that personal risk on yourself. You really, by doing that, open the door for other churches to have these rights.
Right.
And of course, also you run nonprofits, helping people raise money to help businesses that are struggling. Right. You're engaged in other nonprofit organizations like this, helping communities as you see it. I'm curious with all of this, if you were to tell people one thing about the work you do, and really resisting policies that you see are not legal, which it turns out you were right.
Yeah.
What would you tell them about why you've taken the stance you've taken and why this matters?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And one of the things that people have asked is that you're a pastor, your church, just focus on the church. Why are you involved in, political being a dissenter and going and suing the governor? Why don't you just submit to the governing authority? And I share, from Scripture, Jesus asks us to be salt and light. He says, you're the salt of the earth. If the salt has lost its flavor, it's not good for anything but to be thrown on the streets and trodden under men. And that's in Matthew 5:13. But then he says in verse 14, you're the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Let your light shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven. See, I feel that we've been really influenced by Platonic thinking, dualism of, well, here we are the church and the state, let's just say separate. When Jesus says, no, I want you to penetrate the world. That includes the government mountain. And be salt, be light, do good, to preserve. Salt is to preserve. In Korea, we didn't have refrigeration when I was growing up, and so we salted everything, and like, for example, you may know about kimchi, which is a spicy cabbage, but you first salt it and it preserves it, and they put it outside and ferments outside. They bury it, to keep it cool because there's no refrigeration. Well, in the same way, we're to preserve this society, and if not us, who will? And so as a church, I think we've gone into we're so heavenly minded, we're not earthly good. I don't think that's what Jesus wanted. He actually said, occupy, do business until I come back. He told us to disciple nations. Well, what does it mean to disciple nations? Well, yeah, we're to win souls and disciple them, train them. But I think he really meant disciple nations. It's interesting that the Bible says the government is upon his shoulder. I mean, we're talking about Jesus, the Messiah. This is in Isaiah 9, verse 6. But the Bible also says we're the body of Christ, and he's the head. So the shoulder, the government's on our shoulder then, really, that we're to be involved with government. And so our church is unique because a lot of churches are very reticent to speak out and to get involved. But we beg to differ. We feel that is our responsibility because as even Dr. King said, is that, we're not to be over the state's not to be over us, but we're to be the prophetic voice. We're to be the conscience of the state. And so that's what we're trying to do. And I feel that by God's grace, even with the persecution, it's definitely worth it. And I'm willing to do it all over again. Because Jesus himself said, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, in Matthew 5, I believe is verse 9. And so, if I'm persecuted, well, as long as it's done for doing what's right. I don't want to be persecuted for something stupid that I do, but if it's right, then I think we all should do what's right, even if there's consequences of being canceled, cancel culture that's taking place, and so be it. But I'm going to do what's right. At least I can live with myself.
Pastor Che Ahn, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Well, thank you, Joshua. I really appreciate being on your show here. I didn't even know you had a show, but that's great, fantastic. That was just newspaper. Yeah. Great, thank you. Hi, I want to give you a big thank you for watching this video on YouTube. And if you like this, please push the subscribe button, because then we'll get the notice out to you and alert you of new things coming up. But I really believe that God's called us to transform this world through media. And by subscribing, you're going to help us to grow. And so I want to thank you for pushing that button.